promoting compliance with global regulatory requirements. Valerie holds a BS in Civil and Environmental Engineering and an MBA in Information Systems from Keller Graduate School of Management. Valerie will be discussing the validation process and when it's important to consult a validation expert. Valerie?
Thank you, Mike. Today I'm going to talk a little bit more about some practical aspects, if you will, and turn our attention to who is involved actually in the validation process and when should you seek outside validation professional resources. If you look at validation, both of my esteemed colleagues have really articulated the point that validation is really a process. And more than that, it's a dynamic process. From the beginning of the planning stages of validation all the way through the maintenance and operation phases, one must consider all of the documentation that flows from validation and the entire process to ensure that your system stays validated over a period of time, or that you maintain a validated state. Many of you are familiar already with the so-called V model of validation, and out of that V model flows a certain set of documentation. But more importantly, the validation documentation is all interrelated. It's the relationship with these documents that is critical at the end. Not only do you have to maintain the quality assurance of these documents as you do any CGMP documents, but you must also look at the traceability of validation as you go through your particular initiative. When we talk about validation, I like to talk about the whole validation and verification process. The validation that the system performs according to its intended use, and the verification that the requirements that you specified at the beginning of the project is exactly what you get at the end. Many of us have seen at the beginning of processes that sometimes you specify X and at the end of the process you get Y. Without validation and verification, you can waste considerable time, energy, money, resources in terms of validating things that are not necessary. And what I see often in my practice is organizations going overboard, looking at commercially off-the-shelf applications that have very low risk in the same manner that they look at applications that are custom developed with very high risk. So verification without validation is, I think, a consideration that every organization looking at a validation process should consider. And we're going to talk a little bit about how you use professional resources to help you through this process. Who's involved in validation? When we look across validation, the entire process involves many organizations and many individuals. Specifically, quality assurance is at the real heart of software validation. But when we look at a couple of key roles, I've highlighted here on this slide the validation manager, which is really the driver, if you will, or the overall architect of your validation initiative. I look at the business systems owner. Kathy really articulated and brought home the point that you're basically managing your business. So the consideration of business requirements, and more importantly, the integration of business owners in the validation process is really key. When you look at project managers are really responsible for the overall implementation and execution of validation. The project manager role is absolutely critical throughout the process. These guys can save you time and money. And you also need to look at the quality assurance lead. No validation effort is complete or effective without the input of quality assurance. And then you need to have a technical lead to make sure that all of the technical requirements are addressed and that the development progresses in the manner in which you intend. When you look at the role of the validation manager, I think this is one of the critical roles within any validation initiative. This individual is responsible for the overall methodology and the execution of the validation initiative. The validation manager also works hand in hand with the quality assurance manager and the development organization or your technical organization to ensure that the project is on time, within budget, and meets regulatory guideline. The validation manager, in some cases that I've seen, can either make or break the project if this individual doesn't have the skill set necessary and doesn't have the quality assurance background to ensure the effectiveness focus of your validation initiatives. As you go through the validation process, you're going to find variations in your workload, and this may determine when you actually decide to bring in consultants or when you decide to augment your existing staff. At the beginning of the project, you'll notice that the business systems owners and the requirements development people are very much involved at the beginning, because what you're doing is establishing the requirements essential for this validation initiative. So when you look at validation as, mapping a process according to the intended use, as Kathy pointed out, this is very important that you establish these requirements up front. And for even those of you who are using off-the-shelf software, hold your vendor's feet to the fire in terms of getting the requirements down for their software application. Keep the intended use principle in mind during the early stages. As you get to the middle part of your validation initiative, you're going to find more resource load on the design or either the systems integration part. So as we go through systems integration, or as you're deploying off-the-shelf software, you still have to deal with this aspect. And this may involve a significant number of resources during the middle of the project. And then as we move to the tail end, you may see more testing resources that need to be brought to bear. Validation testing is something that specifically the software vendors really focus a lot on. They focus specifically on the IQ, OQ, PQ of validation. But I submit to you that's not all there is to software validation. There's a whole process involved here. So as you look at the resource load across your validation initiative, be sure that you have the right number of resources at the right time during your validation process. As you look at validation as a dynamic process, as I mentioned, maintaining the state of validation is absolutely critical. You need to make sure that the system is validated the first time correctly, but that over time that system maintains a state of validation. You need to be concerned with change control and configuration management control. As you look at your systems, you're going to have operating system changes, you may have network system changes, you may have security changes, you may have a number of changes that come throughout the validation initiative. You need to make sure that these changes are addressed over time and that, more importantly, they are documented and they follow the procedures. When you set up your validation initiative, you need to have standard operating procedures, as we talked about earlier, that really accentuate your validation initiative. These procedures include backup and recovery procedures, software security procedures, and all of the procedures necessary for the effective operation of that system. And don't forget training as a part of your validation initiative. You need to also look at a comprehensive incident management procedure. This is sometimes often overlooked when organizations are validating off-the-shelf software, but you need to make sure that every incident is actually tracked and monitored, and that there is a corrective action process put in place for your validated system to ensure that incidents are corrected and in a controlled manner. When we look at what triggers software validation or revalidation, if you will, new software installation or the integration of new software applications and or modules could actually trigger software validation. Maintenance upgrades, such as the upgrade of the operating system, changes in your network, could also trigger software validation. The addition of new hardware or software could trigger it, or systems integrated requirements. Or as regulations, as you well know, change over time, different predicate rule requirements could also trigger revalidation. The issue is here is in your validation master plan, the triggers for software validation should not only be documented, but they should be followed so that you can make sure that your system is maintained in a validated state. Who are the consultants that you could use for software validation, and what's the business case for consultants? We often get asked this: when do I bring in a consultant and how can they help me in my validation initiative? Well, consultants can play a really key role. Number one, they bring independent expertise to the table. When you look at software vendors with commercially off-the-shelf software, when they give you PQ scripts, those scripts are designed to work the first time, but they don't necessarily offer the independence that a software consultant could bring to the table. So first of all, they bring independence, but more importantly, expertise in software validation can help accelerate the process and deliver best practices for software validation. I run into a lot of companies that have never done a validation project before. They may have never validated an ERP system or never validated an integrated system. Software consultants can be invaluable in helping you save time and money from having to go and learn things and, accelerate the learning curve for your organization. These consultants can actually come in and be very valuable in that whole process. They can also deliver predefined validation protocols and package delivery methodology that can help accelerate your process, but more importantly, ensure that there is a quality process at the heart of your validation initiative. And finally, they can augment your existing staff. If you remember the workload that I discussed, when you look at the validation workload, it varies over the entire life cycle of your validation initiative. Consultants can come in at different points in time during that process to help you accelerate your validation initiative. So there is a good reason for using experienced, qualified validation consultants, and I recommend that you should look at those if you have a either complicated validation initiative or if you're looking to validate a system for the first time. Consultants can be invaluable in helping you through that whole process. So when do you get consultants involved? Get them involved early. You want to get them involved as early in the process as you can so that they understand the requirements and keep in mind that intended use principle. If you are validating a system according to intended use, you need all consultants to understand what the intended use of the system is so that it affects the usability that Kathy was referring to earlier. So get the consultants involved earlier. They can help you to optimize your validation process. If you don't have standard operating procedures in place, they can assist with that. And as we talked about earlier, the comprehensive risk assessment is really critical. I see organizations all the time validating low-risk systems in the same manner that they validate high-risk systems. It is strongly recommended that you conduct a comprehensive risk assessment prior to your validation to ensure that you're not expending valuable resources validating systems that are very low risk. So you want to look at the strategy for your overall validation, and you want to get consultants to really help you with that so that you can have a comprehensive validation assessment around your particular initiative. And also, one of the most overlooked areas is that of migration. I see it all the time. Organizations are either developing custom systems and they're migrating from system A to system B, and they don't consider migration. Migration is absolutely key. Sometimes when you look at custom systems, validation efforts can be about 30% of your validation initiative. But if you have a large migration initiative, it can be even more. I strongly recommend that you take validation or migration into consideration and be careful not to overlook this area. Also, records management. When we look at validation initiatives, you need to make sure that all of the records associated with your validation initiative are properly archived and stored for future use. And also, it is a good idea to conduct an audit management of your validation systems over time. So there's a couple of things that I want you to remember from today. Don't overdo it with respect to validation. Conduct a risk assessment so that you don't validate low-risk systems in the same manner that you validate high-risk systems. Don't forget training. This is also, in addition to migration, an often overlooked area. Remember, those people using validated systems must be